welcome to A Case for America. I am Austin Hepworth, here along with Michael Hepworth, and we are discussing America and the country that we love. As a reminder, when we talk about things, we always approach it from the perspective of the balance point of liberty. To us, liberty is a state between anarchy and tyranny, and anarchy on the one side has no laws, and so some laws are necessary to create a state of liberty, whereas tyranny is where everything's controlled by law and there's no more private solutions or morality. We believe that society and individuals do best when we avoid either of those extremes. And so to us, America and the Constitution was built aiming to strike this balance between these. And so we come talk about the Constitution, talk about various legal principles, and also from a numbers and data perspective, Michael has a background in numbers. I have a background in law. And so today we'll be discussing the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And the 13th Amendment states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And so we have this amendment that it's a little bit different than previous amendments because this amendment actually applies to all. It's not just a restriction on Congress. It's not just a restriction on states or government. It's actually a ban on slavery or involuntary servitude, on private citizens, companies, all these things. So the Constitution is usually viewed as being something that controls government, but the 13th Amendment is pretty expansive. It was meant to put an end to slavery, which for a large part was a private practice among individuals. And it came out to ban that. And so to do that, they had to ban private conduct under the Constitution. So the 13th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment also, Congress has the power to enforce by appropriate legislation. And so we start to get into things, a number of scenarios where from a slavery and voluntary servitude perspective, there are a number of outstanding issues actually still in America about what exactly might constitute involuntary servitude. Slavery, I think it's pretty expressly accepted. That's banned. I don't think there's a lot of active disputes or anything about that side of things. But on the involuntary servitude side, many states for quite a few years did require prisoners to work as a condition for punishment. And it's become actually very, I'd say it's become a fairly hot topic where states don't want to be associated with it anymore. And many states have passed constitutional amendments banning the requirement that prisoners work. And so states for a long time, some still do, to my knowledge, had prisoners make license plates, for example, and they could work, get, the ability to earn some good behavior type points or whatever it was, but they rarely get paid much of anything. And in an interesting lawsuit that was filed late last year, November, December-ish of 2023, Alabama is being sued along with some private companies, McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King and Kentucky Fried Chicken. They're being sued based on the allegation that the state of Alabama places structures in place or puts punishments in place that make it so that inmates basically feel they have to work. Many of these inmates go to work for companies like McDonald's. They're transported there from the jail. They work, and McDonald's pays them the minimum wage, $7.25 or whatever it is right now. And then the state of Alabama takes their cut. The state of Alabama takes 40% of the gross payment before taxes are paid from these convicted criminals. And then the state of Alabama also charges them. It deducts further from their pay for things like the transportation costs, cleaning their uniforms, a number of different things. And so the lawsuit alleges that these convicted individuals end up making between 25 cents to $2.06 an hour. And so they are suing. It's a class action lawsuit alleging that Alabama actually makes over $450 million a year off this program, where they take 40% of the wages of these criminals. And they're alleging it violates a number of things, but particularly the Alabama ban on involuntary servitude. Now, the lawsuit does state that people can choose not to work, but if they choose not to work, they get segregated or put into solitary confinement, a number of different punishments within the system. You lose your ability to talk to your family. They allege that there's a number of punishments that are imposed for these convicts that choose not to work. So it raises this interesting question about, well, what is involuntary servitude? And how do we decide that? And we'll go into some other examples besides just in the criminal justice system of potential where people at least claim there could be some involuntary servitude involved. It doesn't mean we agree with it at all points, but we'll try and talk about both sides of this. But Michael, curious your thoughts initially on involuntary servitude and what it might look like, especially with the Alabama case that's pending.
Yeah, one quick point of clarification. The 13th Amendment allows for it under punishment for a crime, involuntary servitude. And you were discussing how states have banned it outright. Even for punishments for crime, they say that can't happen. So under the 13th Amendment, if as a punishment for a crime, it is allowable for voluntary servitude, but some states are banning it outright for punishments for crime. But yeah, what does it look like? It's kind of a funny line to draw, because when we think of slavery, usually we just think back to as we know it in America and as it appeared there, and we look around and we say, well, yeah, that's not happening today. 13th Amendment doesn't really play any part. But at what point does something you're doing or working on become kind of involuntary? At what point should you be able to choose between doing something and not doing something? I think we can get into a lot of the details and find out maybe it's not as cut and dry as we thought. And sometimes when we want to give people the option to have a lot of freedom, maybe that causes some involuntary servitude for other people that maybe have to provide things for those freedoms. So I think the question is an interesting one, and we'll get into a lot of that as we go forward.
Yeah. I personally, from a moral perspective, I don't have many qualms about work systems for people convicted of crimes. And that's just not something that morally keeps me up at night. I think actually that work is a very healthy way to give back, to try and fix an issue or a problem. Even if you go work for something like McDonald's, I don't even necessarily have a problem with the state taking your paycheck to give restitution to the people or to pay back the cost even of prosecuting you or other things like that. I'm not opposed to restitution measures either that are reasonable. I don't necessarily feel that there's any requirement under the 13th Amendment that a convict be paid money for their labor, because involuntary servitude is allowed, which to me would mean you're not being paid for it. But we start to muddy that water a lot with these rights that we're putting in. And I think you had mentioned some freedoms. I'm thinking you probably meant rights to talk about.
Sorry. Yes, rights is what I meant.
When we place so-called rights in the law and put these into play, what it starts to create some funny scenarios. So as an example, we have a push for socialized medicine. And there's more and more things out there that require doctors to treat people, whether or not those people can pay. And so if you show up to an ER, for example, they have to treat you and take care of you. And something like that begs the question of, well, is that doctor subject to involuntary servitude? Are they being required to work without pay? And is that acceptable under the 13th Amendment? And if that increases in scope, can you just say, well, you know what you're doing as a doctor, so you come over here and you work 2 days a week or 3 days a week or 4 days a week? Is it something, can the government require an hour of involuntary servitude of someone? Do we think that's okay? Or is it just there's no involuntary servitude whatsoever? And even among attorneys for a long time in America were required to take on cases and defend criminals, because criminals were granted under the Constitution a positive right, where they were granted the right to representation if they were charged of a crime. And for many years, America didn't have a public defender system set up. And so the judge would just rotate through attorneys and say, you got to take this case, whether or not the person can pay. And that system, there's a lot of good that came out of that. I think the founders were wise to put in place a system of having a right to representation at trial. But that was a positive right, and the only way to fulfill that positive right was to require someone to work that didn't necessarily voluntarily choose to. And so with other positive rights that come up, we obviously live in a day and age when maybe there'll be enough money to pay. The government will just pay if it imposes a positive right. But to your point, when we have positive rights start to arise, it then starts to create this fuzzy boundary to those providing it of, well, am I doing this voluntarily? Or is this now involuntary servitude? Is the law conscripting me to do something that I wouldn't otherwise do? And on the flip side of that, if you look at something like housing for the homeless or affordable housing or different things, a lot of big pushes right now to house the homeless. If people in America have the option of having a house without having to work, then can those people start to argue and create issues about, well, you can't require me to get a job to live here because that would be involuntary servitude. You just got to provide it. And again, this is a positive right. We start to get into socialism type principles where we're giving things to people. But then it becomes, someone else can say, but why is the money being taken from me to give them housing? Because now I'm the involuntary servant who's providing for their housing through my tax payments. And that dovetails with another interesting scenario. This one actually has been brought up and litigated in cases. Fathers, if they have children or were just married without children, when there's a divorce, a father can be ordered to get a job to provide for the kids and pay child support. Fathers can actually be rounded up, held criminally responsible for not paying child support. And a father sued and said, you can't make me work. He said that violates the involuntary servitude provisions of the 13th Amendment. And I think on its face, looking at it, if a court is ordering someone to get a job and you're under threat of going to jail if you don't, I think there's a decent case on its face to say this is involuntary servitude. Ultimately, the courts looked at it and said, yeah, no, you chose to have a kid, and so you can be required to provide for that kid. And that's a scenario that I morally agree with. I personally think fathers should have to provide for their children. But it's an interesting one that's really not talked about. We have this big abortion debate about a woman's body, her choice, whether or not she can be required to provide life to a child, a 9-month, tenant space essentially. But fathers can be ordered to work for 17 years, 18 years technically, to provide for their kids. And now, granted, are they the same situations? No. Men and women have very different situations. There's a lot of different things going on. Being required to work is different than being required to carry a baby to term. But if you talk about a right to life with the abortion side of things, some people could argue that the woman is an involuntary servant now that has to carry that baby. But on the flip side, the dad that may not want a kid and the mom chooses not to have an abortion could also be required to work and provide for that child for 18 years as an involuntary servant, they would call it. And so life is something that so far the courts have looked at and said, yeah, ultimately we can impose requirements on people to do things associated with keeping children alive. And that's something that we still see that debate playing out in America. It's far from ended. I think it will be one that rages for quite some time. But again, on the father side of it, just looking from a 13th Amendment perspective, the courts have said, yeah, we're not going to call that involuntary servitude to make a dad pay child support for his children. And Michael, curious what thoughts you have on some of those things with the rights or the father situations.
Yeah, one thing I want to jump back to is when you discussed providing, say, medical care as in an ER, or even under some government Medicare, Medicaid plans. Some people will say that it's not involuntary servitude because the government is paying doctors to do some of those things. But I think we have to dig a little deeper and look at how that works. The government pays a rate to hospitals or ERs or doctors. It usually doesn't match up with what a doctor normally charges. It's usually lower than what their costs are. And then they end up passing costs on to other patients not covered by Medicare or Medicaid to try to make up the difference. And so what you see is government underpaying doctors, they're charging other people more. And so is that involuntary servitude to other individuals not covered by Medicare or Medicaid? How about where does the government get the money from? You touched on this. Government doesn't generate wealth on its own. It cannot. So it taxes individuals, or it prints money, which is another way of taxing. So ultimately, it comes back to people in this country who are responsible for paying for that. At what point is that involuntary servitude? I think these are really important questions to ask when we start saying that individuals, people deserve to have something provided for them from the government. I'm not saying that the government should never, work in any kind of service, but I think we should have these honest conversations and say, at what point do we say that's not really the government providing that? That's ordering people to work where they shouldn't have to work. But we need to have those conversations more often than we have the conversation of, well, this person deserves this. And I think it's the same thing with husbands being ordered to pay. I'm with you on that. I think we need to make sure that when you've made a commitment to somebody, whether implicitly or explicitly, you're going to have a child, you're making a commitment, and in society we should honor those commitments. And if you don't want to, you're backing out, you say, I don't want to take care of this child, I'm fine with ordering somebody to live up to their commitments. I think it makes sense to me, but we do need to try to define where we draw the line between forcing people to take care of what we deem to be somebody else's rights and where that seems to make more sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There was looking at, I guess, sorry, another way to frame this. The 13th Amendment text is just pretty broad. It says no slavery or involuntary servitude, except for crimes. And so from a textual perspective, it just says you can't force me to work. Now, in our society, we've actually found a number of reasons to still force people to work. And the courts ultimately say, yeah, that doesn't violate the 13th Amendment. But it goes back to this point that I try to make fairly often, especially when I talk about the Constitution to groups or other people, is that the text of the Constitution has never been the highest law of the land. The courts will always look and say, is there a good reason to say it's not banned by this text? Is there a good reason to let the government do what it's doing? And those good reasons, they can call them a compelling reason. They call it sometimes strict scrutiny. They talk about ways that they review things, but they're looking to see if there's a sound moral basis for going against the express text of the Constitution. And every constitutional challenge will look to see if the government has a compelling interest, which means a strong moral basis to do what it's doing. And if so, they will allow it to still continue, even if on its face it looks like it violates the text of the Constitution. And that brings me to a place of saying the text certainly controls at times. But there's other times when morality controls. And if you go back to the balance where some law is necessary, but some morality is necessary, I actually believe strongly that the Constitution, coupled with morality, is the supreme law of the land. And to give an example of that, during the World War I era, when the U.S. is drafting people again. So we had the Civil War. After the Civil War, we get the 13th Amendment that says no slavery or involuntary servitude. And then America goes through a time where there's not just these major pressing wars until World War I comes up. And so America institutes the draft, and people start looking at the 13th Amendment going, hey, you can't draft me. That's involuntary servitude. It's even a form of slavery because I can lose my life. I don't want to be here. This isn't my choice. And it's interesting if you go back on the First Amendment side of things with the freedom of speech, there were groups at the time who passed out pamphlets arguing that the draft was unconstitutional because of the 13th Amendment. I personally think that's a very valid claim to make. I'm not saying I necessarily fully agree with it, but I think it's a valid legal claim based on the text of the 13th Amendment. And these individuals were put in jail for opposing the draft. It was illegal to oppose the draft, and they were put in jail. They appealed their cases to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court allowed their convictions to stand, saying that it was a clear and present danger to the United States, and these people couldn't be arguing against the draft. They didn't argue that people became violent, but they did argue that people stand up and try and push legislation to overturn the draft and things, and they were put in jail for it. And so again, it's interesting to look at and say, okay, the Supreme Court felt the world was at war, the country was at risk. What do we do about it? And they said, the morality of this, the gravity of the situation means that we can put people in jail for articulating legal positions. And guess what? This involuntary servitude thing doesn't apply to the draft. Now, again, where does the text say that? It doesn't. The only way that courts come to that conclusion is through a moral analysis of, well, if we held that the draft was no longer because of the 13th Amendment, that might mean that we lose our country. And so from a moral perspective, they adopted a morality that defense of the country was of paramount importance, and that the government could go against things like the 13th Amendment. And it's the same with fathers being forced to work. They look at that and say, from a moral perspective, we can absolutely make you do that, 13th Amendment notwithstanding. And so that brings us full circle to today, where looking back on COVID and what took place then, the government came out and mandated that businesses enforce mask mandates. To me, when I saw that as an attorney, I said, they just conscripted thousands, hundreds of thousands of new police officers. These people are being required to enforce the law. And I personally don't see a moral basis, I should say, I don't see a constitutional basis for allowing that. Because as a citizen, I'm a business owner and I don't know how to de-escalate a violent situation. People would get crazy angry. Some would get violent over being asked to put on a mask. I'm not trained in that. I don't carry a taser. I don't carry a gun. I don't have all these things on me at all times. And yet the government said, you have to enforce these laws if you want to be open for business. Now, they might say it was voluntary that I chose to be open for business. But I'd say, but I have to be open for business in order to make money for my family and myself. I'm even compelled as a dad to provide for my kids. It's not voluntary that I'm here. We are trying to make a living. And I don't have a way to operate in this world without money. Now, obviously, if you just took the money thing to its extreme, then all kinds of people would be arguing they weren't voluntarily doing things. And so the courts don't fully accept that as being involuntary when you're working for money. But just from the perspective of saying you have to enforce a mask mandate, I look at it and said, you just conscripted new police officers. And what gives the government the ability to force people to be a police officer is something I feel very strongly the government should have no right to place compliance obligations on somebody for somebody else. It's one thing maybe for the government to make you do your own compliance, like with taxes and file your own tax returns. But it's an entire another to say, but we can send you to jail for someone else's non-compliance because you didn't make them comply. That to me feels very much like involuntary servitude. And it feels very much to me like the government's really out of balance. If they can just tell me at any time, you have to enforce this law, and this one's on you. I say, when did I become a police officer? I'm not a police officer. I'm not an enforcer of the law. That's your job, government. And if you want me to do that, offer me a job, offer to pay me well, train me. Maybe I'll say yes, maybe I'll say no. But you can't make me do that. And I guess I'm curious, Michael, to know what you think of that situation. If you have thoughts on being required to enforce the law and how that compares to involuntary servitude.
Yeah, I think that really damages the balance between government and the citizens. I think the way the Constitution's laid out, it very clearly shows that not only do we have separation inside the government of powers, but there's separation between governments and states, the federal government and the states, and separation between the people. They're explicitly called out. And if at any point the government can say, well, now this group of people is now part of the government, we're just going to own them, it really shakes up that balance. What balance do we have as citizens if at any moment the government can turn to you and say, you belong to this group, you're now part of the government. And if you don't, enforce the laws that we've asked you to enforce, you're in trouble. So I think it's a major blow to the proper balance between citizens and the federal government. I think it undermines the integrity of the federal government. If the federal government is going to make policies, the federal government needs to be able to enforce their own policies, be the federal government, and not conscripting all the citizens to be part of the government. But it goes further than that. You talked about with COVID and masks. You could look down to where they ask businesses who sell things to collect sales tax. They are asking businesses who provide goods to somebody to collect taxes for them. So the government isn't collecting taxes anymore. They're not asking individuals to report their own taxes. they're asking businesses to report taxes for somebody else. I think that's another area that we should be concerned about, where as soon as the government feels like they want revenue from a transaction, they will go to the businesses that are providing the transaction and say, you are now responsible for collecting this revenue for us, instead of the government saying, we're going to collect the revenue and we will enforce how we get it. But to take it down to the level of the business or individuals who sell things are required to collect sales tax. And so it's a serious blow to the proper balance between powers of the government and the citizens. And it's an interesting one when you talk about money. If you're doing something for money, is it involuntary servitude? Because maybe on the comical side for some, serious side for others, is things like self-checkout at Walmart. I've seen individuals say, hey, this is involuntary servitude. And I think if you go as far as anything you do for somebody else is involuntary servitude, is it involuntary servitude that you have to walk around Walmart and pick out your own groceries? They do provide a service that they will bring that to you for a fee. Should they have to provide that for free? I think it's back to the question of balance. Federal government needs to be able to provide their own enforcement for their laws. And we as citizens need to not ask so much from the federal government. If we have issues with Walmart and their self-checkout, I think that's something we can resolve between us and Walmart. But it's part of that balance between how much do we ask of the government. Don't ask the government maybe to keep us safe all the time, because what ends up happening is they just try to conscript business owners to do their will for them.
Yeah, and it's just following up on the self-checkout thing quickly. Again, it could be a little comical. People could roll their eyes about it being involuntary servitude. But just to share, to make a few more connections with it, I was at a Sam's Club once, and they closed. They never announced that it was the store closed. So we were there, I don't know, 5 minutes past their official time or something. And we go up to the front. We have a big cart full of product. And all their cashiers have fled. There's no cashiers around anywhere. And there's a manager standing there, and he says, well, you're one of the people left in the store. You have to do self-checkout. And I said, there's a whole cart full of stuff here. And he goes, we've closed everything. I said, you didn't even tell us it was closed. Never heard anything saying it. But he said, we're not opening again. If you want to, you can leave your stuff and leave, or you can do self-checkout. And so as I'm there doing self-checkout, one of the problems with self-checkout is if you miss something and don't scan it, you can be accused of theft. And that's an offense that, at least if you're not in certain states, like California, that struggles with some things of theft, enforcing some things of theft, you can go to jail for that. And one of the assurances that come by going through a cashier is that at least you can't be accused of theft if you put it all up there. If they miss something, that's on them. If you miss something, you can be accused of theft. And it was interesting to me to be at Sam's Club that day and have them just going, your only option is self-checkout. We're not giving you any other option. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because now the whole compliance burden's on me to ensure I do everything just perfect. Because even at Sam's, their boxes are covered with different barcodes, and some of them work, some of them don't, because some of them are for, inventory or something, I don't know. And it takes a while to sometimes figure it out, watch the machine, make sure you get everything right. And it's not just a walk in the park for all these products. And I bring that up because to your point about sales or taxes and sales tax, businesses they're conscripted tax collectors in the sales tax realm. And Utah, back in, I think it was 2019, wanted to impose a sales tax on services. So to make every service provider in the state start to collect sales tax on their services. And to give an example of what that might mean, I'm an attorney. I provide services to clients. I'll draft a contract for them, draft a will, provide legal services, whatever. But every city where the service is delivered, can impose their own sales tax rate. And so I'd have to collect from every client their address. I'd have to know how that corresponded to a certain sales tax rate in Utah. I would have to charge an additional fee and collect that. If I didn't collect it, if the client didn't pay it, it just comes out of my stuff. I could go to jail if the client didn't pay stuff and that I didn't collect. And then I have to file and remit taxes for every city based on every tax code associated with that. And in addition, I do work for people who live in other states. At times they'll call up with a Utah legal issue or a business issue or whatever. And trying to collect and remit sales tax for all these places gets to be pretty wild. Incredibly time consuming. Just incredibly time consuming. And as a business owner, tracking and collecting sales tax is not a simple measure. Right now in America, this changed, I don't remember what it was, 3, 4, 5 years ago. The Supreme Court used to not allow states to mandate shippers of products to collect sales tax on every single jurisdiction they shipped into. But they changed that and finally allowed companies to do that. And so now in America, if I remember the numbers right, it was either 11 or 14,000. There are either 11 or 14,000 sales tax jurisdictions in the US, which means there's a little local unit that can impose a certain tax rate that's different from all the other ones. And so you could live in a school district within a city, and that school district could have one sales tax rate that's different from another school district sales tax rate in the same city. You could have a water district with a different sales tax rate. So if you're getting your water from this well, then your sales tax is X. If you're getting your water from this well, it's Y, kind of thing. And so now, if you want to ship a product anywhere in the world or anywhere in the US, you're supposed to collect sales tax on every shipment and pay it to that state, which means file a sales tax return, pay it. And there are some software services that help track this, but they're expensive. And for small businesses, it's almost impossible to comply. It's just crazy. But you are a mandated, conscripted tax collector. And I look at that and just go, where did we get off in America where you go back to the Robin Hood days, you go back to the days of the Bible, the tax collectors were hated people. Because the government had to come knocking on your door and get its own taxes. That was always an obligation of the government. And now the government says, oh, that's so much work. We miss so many taxes if that's the case. No one wants to be a tax collector, so we'll just make you do it in order to run a business. And I look at it and am just appalled, honestly, that in America we are okay with the conscription of tax collectors. Nobody should have to be a tax collector. I think in the Bible they refer to them as publicans. And these are things that are serious, I believe, that to me very much violate the letter and spirit of the 13th Amendment. I don't believe that anyone should have to collect taxes in exchange for the right to work. To me, that's involuntary. And I think it's a big issue. And so these are things that we look at in America, we talk about in America somewhat, but we don't fully give full discussion to. Even during COVID, I didn't see hardly anyone discussing the forced compliance with mask mandates as being a conscription of police services. Maybe I'm exaggerating that, but there were, I think if I remember right, there were some people shot and killed over it that tried to enforce it. There was a couple of shooting deaths where people were upset, pulled out a gun, shot the person that was telling them they had to put on a mask. There were a lot of angry people associated with mask mandates. And to put that burden on $10 an hour workers that have to tell these people walking into the store, you got to wear a mask here, put it on, or else we'll all be in trouble, is something that, to me, profoundly runs afoul of the Constitution here in America and the things we stand for. That's not an individual citizen's place, a position to be put into that they have to enforce these laws. the government if they want to enforce them. Let the business call the police if they want, and the police come on out. But if you don't have a police force that's big enough to enforce the law, don't make the law, or create the police force necessary to enforce it. But otherwise, it's not okay, I believe, to make people be police officers for any of these laws.
Something I thought really interesting about this whole situation is the 13th Amendment came about to originally to prohibit slavery, to help with that protection. And as we discussed earlier, that really came down to mostly private entities. So there's a law put in place to really outlaw the indentured servitude, the involuntary servitude, and the slavery in private entities. And today it almost seems, with many of the things we're trying to push through the government, that we are championing that in the federal government or at the state level. We're saying, all right, we won't let the businesses do that. We won't let people do that. But hey, federal government wants to conscript people to be tax collectors. I'm all for it. It's kind of an interesting switch where we said to the private companies, you can't do it, but federal government, go ahead. It's kind of an interesting change in mindset, I think.
Yeah, it is. That's a good point to make, that where it goes to why in the world, what is causing this shift. And part of it is we've lived under it for a while, so we accept it. Part of it is it's convenient, because if the business doesn't collect sales tax, I as an individual have to then keep track of my purchases. I have to report it to the government. I have to pay taxes on it. And that's something that most of us don't like to do. We don't like our own responsibility, so we push it onto someone else. But from the perspective of constitutional rights and a system of liberty, we can't expect to keep our liberties if we don't accept the responsibility associated with what we need to do. As individuals, we may have to keep track of what we spend and do different things to keep liberties, to say, yeah, the government can't conscript people to be tax collectors or police officers. Those are things we might have to do, even though it's not convenient for us. But if we just want convenience and it's just, it's easier if the business just takes it from me at the point of sale, I'm okay with it, then we've suddenly said, the convenience associated with forced involuntary servitude is great. I like it. And then what happens is the government more and more is now regulating by mandating businesses enforce things. And so the federal government tried with businesses to say, yeah, you're going to be the vaccination police now. We're not going to go around and do this, but if your people want to work, they have to be vaccinated. And more and more you see companies tasked with these compliance burdens. Even the federal government recently passed the Corporate Transparency Act. It went into effect January 1st, 2024. And the Corporate Transparency Act requires small business owners to file all kinds of reports with the federal government that lets them know exactly where these small business owners are, how much equity they hold, gives them their photo ID, a bunch of things. And I look at that and I go, why do we as the small business owners have the obligation to just give the government information? And the government just sits there. All that they do is build a web portal, and they just take in this information and they say, if you don't comply, it's penalty of up to $500 a day. That gets pricey really, really quickly. And to me, more and more, the government says, this is a lot of work. Just have the businesses do it. Make them do it. If they want the right to work, they want the right to earn some money, make them do it. Make them do it. And so currently, even as an attorney, I represent businesses. It's difficult to comply. It sucks a lot of resources and time out of businesses to comply with all their obligations. As a business owner, if I hire an employee, I have to go in and report to the state where that employee is, who they are, what their social is. The state says it's so that they can force them to pay child support if necessary. But now I'm conscripted in the push to get people to pay child support. I have to withhold wages and send it to the federal and state government or else I get in really big trouble if I don't timely pay those. Very serious penalties, can be criminal. And things like, again, the sales tax obligations, all these things weigh on you as a business owner. It's impossible to keep track of everything perfectly when you're just trying to keep the business operating. And I look at it and feel very strongly, again, that we should talk a little bit more about this involuntary servitude aspect and about what it is and what it isn't, because I don't feel it's appropriate at all for the government to pass laws that normal citizens bear the responsibility of. Like you said, Michael, it throws off our whole balance, our whole foundation of the government's supposed to be for us. It's supposed to be to help create the state of liberty. But now it's something that says, ha ha ha, if you want this, here's all these obligations on you. And then they say it's voluntary because, oh, well, it's based on money. You don't have to run your own business, Austin. You can just go get a job. But it fully denies the fact that in America, small businesses still run a significant portion of the economy. And the only way that the economy works is through small businesses and small business owners and people who make these things happen. And there's not a job for every single person in America. Some people have to make a go of it on their own. And so it's not true to say that's entirely voluntary. But overall, again, we don't go there often. It's not something we talk about often, but it is one that's interesting to me to look at, to say, why are we so opposed to criminals working? If someone shot and killed somebody, why are we opposed to them working and earning money for restitution? I don't know all the reasons that people are opposed to it. I haven't fully followed all those. But in the same vein, I guess one thing to throw out too quickly is the involuntary servitude side goes into a lot of the child labor laws that came into place that said children can't work because children don't exactly have the choice. So that gets into chores, household chores. Can you make a kid work? And the laws have tried to strike a balance between household work versus work for money and out in society. But that is another place where laws have had to come in to stop a bunch of involuntary servitude with the forced labor of children. So anyway, some of the areas, Michael, I don't know if you have any more thoughts or comments on any of these things.
No, your point at the end, I think, is important about children, just because it kind of highlights that we need to have these conversations, because I don't know that involuntary servitude is all very cut and dry as sometimes we like to think it is. I think we need to have a lot of conversations about what it involves and what it doesn't, where maybe it's appropriate, as the amendment kind of says, perhaps for punishment in crime, or for a father providing for a child after a divorce. But I think we really need to dig in and talk about this, and not just assume that because we don't see slavery as we recognize it a long time ago, that this is all working out just fine.
Yeah. And I think as we see a proliferation of rights that continue to be pushed, we'll see more and more pushback too from people that feel they're being forced to do things. And I think that voice will grow. And it's something to be aware of, that if we're going to go this path as a country, which I don't personally believe that we should be granting more and more rights, and especially on the positive right side, those should be very limited. But if we do go that route, there will be a conflict with this involuntary servitude side. And we're starting to see that, where bakers allege, you can't make me bake a cake. Website designers say, you can't make me design a website. They're not relying on the 13th Amendment for their arguments, but in essence, that's what they're saying, is you can't force me to work and do certain things. The non-discrimination laws that come into play, I think we'll see more and more conflict over people feeling forced to do things that they're opposed to, that they don't want to do. Because the more we proliferate rights, the more we're going to have people with moral disagreements on those things. And so it's just to know society will have a conflict. Is it impossible to work through? Not necessarily, but to keep the balance, to keep people motivated to work, to do their best, to be their best. The American system that generally lets each person rise or fall based on their work and conduct is one that's proven to be the best so far for bringing the world very far along with the developments and things. And so the American legal system that generally respects personal property rights and people's ownership in things has radically altered this whole world with all the inventions and technology and things that have come. But it's one that we could potentially undo if we're not careful in making people feel forced to work. Because when people feel forced to work and they're not criminals, it reduces the incentive to work and do things. And it also runs afoul of basic moral notions of making people do things that may violate their beliefs. And with as diverse society as we have in America, we don't live in a time when discrimination is so overwhelmingly pervasive that we're blocking out entire groups of people. You may have people that refuse to help this group or that group at times. But as a whole in our society, you can almost always find what you need. And so I think that it's one we need to talk about some to say, we can't mandate that people provide services for everyone all the time. Obviously, I'm not advocating for the removal of all discriminatory protections, but just to say there's a balance and we can't continue to expand all the discriminatory protections without going off balance. And that will produce conflicts and issues with people. So, but again, overall, we'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts on what is or isn't involuntary servitude, especially in some of the examples, fathers supporting children, the draft. Can you require a doctor to work and save somebody? Are these different things that we can or can't do? And then look at that in light of the 13th Amendment, what it was trying to accomplish, and how we square that away with constitutional interpretation, with morality, with these compelling interests the courts will look at. So next week, we'll pick up again on the 14th Amendment. There's quite a bit to unpack in the 14th Amendment, so we may have more than one podcast on that. But we appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to talking with you more later. Thanks so much.